intended to be. So, Masuda, if you're sharing your screen, would you be able to put up the document that was in our, I think it went to board papers. I think everybody might have seen it already, but it gives us a starting point. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Terry, did you want to remind the group that we're actually recording this meeting?
Yes, thank you. This is a public meeting. We are recording, so this meeting will be posted on our website in the same way that others are. So thank you for reminding me of that. So Mark, if you would, did you want to, I think you were on the last, you were in the last listening session, but did you want to meet people first or just go through the classes and set-asides and discussion points that we have?
That's entirely up to you. I'm fine with any approach.
Perfect.
Mark, why don't you introduce yourself to the group and then we can get started because we only have an hour. So
exactly.
Maybe that's the best way to go about it. Thank you.
Sounds good. So yes, Mark Shelburne. I'm a housing policy consultant with Novogradac, and I spent most of my career as the attorney and policy coordinator for the Housing Finance Agency tax credit allocator in North Carolina. I also directed the affordable rental investment programs in Georgia for about a year. But for the last 5 years, I have again been with Novogradac doing policy consulting, and one of the main components of my work is exactly what we're doing here, advising agencies on their qualified allocation plans. I'm now up to 12 of them across the country, and several of them have done for a few years running. And so I'm very happy to get to work with you on this endeavor.
Thank you, Mark. If you would then present the discussion points for us.
Certainly. Absolutely. And just want to note that it would probably work best if folks jumped in as we went through the discussion with questions or comments, because as opposed to waiting to the end, although again, that's entirely up to anyone else on the call. That's just a suggestion. So when I work with states, on their QAPs, one of the really very, very few suggestions I make to every one of them every time is to create two distinct separate competitions between proposals to rehabilitate existing occupied housing and proposals to create new affordable rental housing. And so the idea is that it's essentially impossible to come up with criteria which allow those two proposals to compete on an equivalent basis within for the same sets of credits. And so there's a real need to create two distinct pots, two distinct set-asides or classes of credits for the two different types of proposals to compete to receive. And so the split of those, as you'll see in here, I left blank because I didn't have a number to propose for how much to put in the rehab versus the new construction. Since then, Terry has done some very impressive research on what the recent history has been in Connecticut. And that's certainly something that you guys could talk about and hear about if you wanted. But my suggestion again is to create the two different competitions. And so what you'll then see also within these set-asides are three different other ones which operate in a different manner. And so the first that you see listed here is the nonprofit. And this is effectively a function of Internal Revenue Code Section 42. Congress mandates that the 10% of the credits go to nonprofits. And so what this does is allows CHFA to achieve that result if it weren't going to occur otherwise. Now, my understanding is you have a lot of nonprofit participation in your state, so it probably won't be necessary. So this is very little of a change from what you have currently. The next set aside is, I believe, also in effect, not a tremendous change from the way your awards have operated, depending on the amount that goes into that blank there. The idea being that properties sponsored by housing authorities would compete in either the new construction or the rehab set-asides, and the final results at the end of the day would result in a certain number of them receiving an award. Now, again, that number is something that others with more specific knowledge of the recent results in Connecticut would need to propose. But the idea being that CHFA would do its awards internally as it would under its criteria, and it would look to see, do we have X, whatever that blank is, number of housing authority properties receiving awards, and if not, then they would skip down until that result occurs. So that's how that would operate. And I've got in there proposed criteria for what counts as a housing authority property, but again, that's something that you with more specific recent knowledge could certainly expand on and or change. And then the last here in the discussion of set-asides is what would be an entirely new one. So the idea is called unique opportunities. In some jurisdictions, this is called an innovation round, and others, they call it an executive director's or secretary's pick. And so any of those works as a title. I just prefer this phrasing because I think it gets at the concept a little more specifically. And the idea being that it's fundamentally impossible for any set of criteria, no matter how thoughtful, to contemplate every possible fact pattern out there. And it very much can happen that there is an application which, for whatever reason, just really needs to get funded. It just has to get across the finish line. But also, for whatever reason, again, mainly because selection criteria can't be perfect, it just didn't happen to be above the line when those factors, and when CHFA applied those factors. So this gives a way to give that proposal a chance to get funded when it wouldn't otherwise. And a key component of this is it's possible that in a particular year it doesn't happen, that no property does get this treatment because all the ones that do need to get funded did get funded. And so, but again, this creates a possibility to do so. So that's the overview of the set-asides. I certainly could move on to discuss the selection criteria, but it's also a real natural point in time to take questions or comments, if there are any.
Mark, thank you. This is Lisa Tepper-Bates. I do have a question. If you can scroll back up. I'm just wondering that I have my own sort of thoughts that I could, sort of guess at when you say that it's really not possible to create a fair competition, if you will, between new construction and preservation. Couldn't one sort of argue that, dollars per unit of affordable housing, right? That there should be a way to put things on an equal playing field. Can you explain what the complicating factors are from your perspective?
Well, it's from having watched QAPs play out since 2000 that there's been a lot of states have tried to come up with systems that allow new construction and rehab to compete on an equal basis, and none of them have figured it out. So I will absolutely grant that it's theoretically possible. There's a first time for everything, but I don't know what that would be. And also, I don't know that it is necessary to try, particularly considering as a state, you already have a track record of two different groupings, two different set-asides. And so this would basically just change the nature of those two different set-asides.
I guess I'm coming from the perspective that I think that whatever we do here should be guided by what we're trying to accomplish, right? And if what we're trying to accomplish is to really to expand the stock of affordable housing, which is a challenge, which there's so much of it going offline in the next few years. So I guess, and I don't pretend there's an easy answer to this. And I think my colleague Kylie is here. Kylie, you and the partnership really have done a lot of great work in this area with regard to the units we're losing. But I think we have struggled in previous conversations to think about how do we keep our eye on the ball of wanting to expand, not contract, the stock of affordable housing with the resources that we have. So I guess that's where I'm coming from, but I'll leave it there and see if others have thoughts.
Well, and actually creating it this way gets at your point, because what it does is allows CHFA.
I'm on this darn meeting too.
It allows Connecticut to decide how much of its resource it wants to go to rehab and how much it wants to go to new construction, as opposed to leaving it up to chance as to how the developers happen to respond to and what they happen to find. So this way you can be very intentional and very deliberate in determining which things you want to have happen a certain way. So actually it goes to what you're suggesting have happen.
I think too, the part of the thing that is really difficult to factor into this calculation, building on what Lisa was saying, is that, LIHTC isn't the only game in town. It may arguably be the biggest game in town in terms of driving policy and driving project location, direction, all that kind of stuff. But there are other resources that we have to use for, some of these other projects like home and other, there's other financing sources. So this is just, we have to keep in mind just the LIHTC portion of the wider picture of state and federal funding for affordable housing in the state. But I agree with the there's a research group in Cheshire whose name is escaping me now. PARC is their acronym, and they do a lot of research in the space, which Lisa was referring to, which we've published some of, talking about, the approximately 5,000 units a year over the next 5 years that are reaching the end of their affordability cycle. So, some of those will want to seek funding and continue on as as affordable housing and other units may be ripe to go market rate depending on where they are. And so it's also a sort of targeted conversation too about location and preservation, where we want to preserve versus where we want to build new. And having flexibility would be helpful, but it's hard. I agree. It's hard to put a number on that, on the split there.
Well, by creating different set-asides, you can very deliberately create criteria to directly address that if that's what the state wants to do. Again, as opposed to hoping that developers happen to come up with the right mix of points to maybe achieve that result.
This is Kathy McKinnon. I think the split will be even more important as the sustainability criteria becomes more rigorous, because I think that's where you really see, a difference between new construction and rehab. The ability to have more efficient, tighter building envelopes, that kind of thing is more of a challenge in the rehab. So I think this would be a good idea, as those criteria increase.
Yeah, thank you for making that point. That's absolutely right. And that's design criteria are a perfect example of why it's important to treat these differently. A related note is any policies regarding construction costs. With rehabs, it's actually arguably good to spend more, because that means you're working on a project where tenants' lives would be more improved by doing more work, as opposed to new construction where spending more might mean that you're being less efficient as a developer. So and those are just two examples. There are dozens of them where treating new and rehab differently has a good logical outcome.
Hey, Mark, Tim Hodges, two questions for you. One, in terms of the work that you've done in the states that you've looked at, are there more states that have just a single round, or do they have a double round? If they do have 2 rounds, do they maybe separate these even more and having a new construction round and then a public housing round later on in the year? And then to that point, my second point, how well do states do in terms of public housing units in terms of scheduling? Meaning, we know this is the life cycle of a development. We're at the let's say it's 30 years. At year 25, we're talking to them, and as Kylie pointed out, if it's 5,000 units a year, do they have that on a schedule so that you just don't have people competing kind of all the time, understanding that they're competing and they may or may not win, but they actually have a schedule to say you're coming up. You should be in the bin at this point in terms of making an application. Does that make any sense?
Sure it does. I don't know that I followed exactly.
Well, then it didn't make any sense.
No, I'm sure it did. I just there's some Connecticut specific aspects there maybe that I may not have followed. But I definitely can address at least the first part, and then maybe we can come back to the second part. To my knowledge, there's only 2. There had been 3. There's now, again, as far as I know, only 2 states that have 2 application rounds in a year. And if you don't mind me editorializing, I genuinely think that's one of the least good things that an agency can do. And the reason why is because it forces developers, and this happens in it's California and Michigan. And when you look at their applications and awards, what you see is a group of applications will come in. This many could have gotten funded and they're all perfectly good, but the state artificially cuts it in half. And so if you're a developer, you could have gotten your deal funded, but the state says, nope, we're going to not give you the credits now. We're going to make you wait. We're going to hold off and only award half. And so that half of developments that could have gone forward that were perfectly good, they're then forced to reapply in the next cycle. So the developer has to spend all that extra money, and the agency has to basically spend twice as much time reviewing those applications for the exact same results on the ground. So because of that, realizing that, Illinois, a few years ago, decided they had had enough, and so they went back from that. There is a state, though, that had a 2 different round approach. Pennsylvania a few years ago had it to where any one application was only eligible in one particular cycle. And so that avoided the painful inefficiencies and real problems that happen in California and Michigan, but and then allow the staff to space out its work. So that seemed to be of some benefit there in Pennsylvania, but all those states are bigger than Connecticut. So it's not really clear that it would be necessary in Connecticut. I think what would be more helpful to consider there, and this isn't something that's covered in this document, but it is an important thing to consider, is having a 1 round, but 2 stages to where you have a preliminary and a full application. And so what that allows is the development community can submit these preliminary applications for a tremendously less investment. They have to spend far less to get their applications ready to submit, and in so doing, find out what the competition is going to be. So they get to be informed as to what really matters without having to make a big investment. And then they can make a decision based on that information as to whether they want to do the full application later. So that's something that I do think makes a lot of sense. And so again, that's all to respond to your first point. Again, of course, I'm not entirely sure how to respond to your second point about
yeah, and I don't want to take
authorities.
up a ton of time here, so let me just 10 seconds here. So what I'm trying to get to is, in theory, right, we know how many public housing authorities there are, how many units are out there. we know what the life cycle of a or what units or development needs to be rehabbed. Are there states that utilize the QAP to basically schedule those rehabs for public housing units so that you don't have all of them competing at once?
Oh, yeah, I don't know. I haven't heard of that specifically happening. I suppose that theoretically could occur, but it would involve a level of state and local cooperation and interlocal cooperation that is certainly possible, but I haven't seen it happen. And
Yeah.
so, but if someone could really make that work and truly prioritize, yes, my housing authority really needs to move forward now, whereas yours can wait. If everyone can come to an agreement on that, it would certainly make life a lot easier. But getting to that point, I could see being challenging potentially.
Yeah, you said we're a small state. We work fairly well together.
There you go. That's true. Exactly. Well, with that, we probably should move on through the next set of criteria, which are threshold requirements. And we can really cover this very quickly because these are just my proposals for how these can work. But the Connecticut QAP has a lot of longstanding requirements, mandates along these lines. And so some of these would be in addition to, some of these would be in replacement of, but it's largely to reflect that, again, we're creating the two separate treatments between new construction and rehab. And so, I don't know who's running this, but whoever it is could just sort of maybe scroll through this so folks can look at the headings and see if there's any questions that jump out as we look through. But again, I don't know if there's any of these that really merit a lot of time or discussion necessarily, especially considering now we're to the halfway point and we still have to talk about the headline issue of selection criteria. So maybe we can go to the next page.
This is Kylie. I just want to note in this, and this may tie in with the selection criteria. One of the things I don't see here that I think we can get to in the selection criteria, but may also be something we want to consider for threshold. I don't know if there are any sort of market targets. So in other words, looking at the existing market around the neighborhood of a certain radius of how many other projects are there and what income groups those particular projects are servicing. In other words, whether it's rehabilitation or new construction, looking at what's in the immediate vicinity of that, what is it already, who is it serving? Is this serving a new population there? Is it, there's other sort of elements of that, but just noting that that is something that may tie into some of the other conversations we're having about location and concentrations.
That's the consideration of how, especially for new construction, how potential projects relate to existing affordable housing is certainly something that a QAP can consider. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's all, and you can have that type of consideration be even more directive and more consequential if the allocating agency is the one ordering the market study. And so that's something that is another related consideration as to how important you want that criteria to be. The more important it is, the more sense it makes for, again, the agency to be the one contracting for the study, which that can be unpopular with certain groups.
Mm-hmm.
Other topics, other questions or comments on the threshold considerations? I think we have, I'm not sure, I think we have one more page of thresholds. Yep. There you go. And that's, yeah. But again, none of this is very new or different or controversial necessarily. By contrast, we certainly could come back to some of these threshold topics. The notion here of the rehab selection criteria is fairly new for Connecticut and potentially radical. And just to give an explanation as to the reason for this proposal, developers, like anyone, are entirely rational, logical, and they're going to make choices and make proposals based on what makes sense for their circumstance. And sometimes folks use the phrase point chasing as pejorative, and it's understandable to see that as pejorative, but really it's just a shorthand for saying that developers are going to present their proposal in the most favorable light possible so as to get an award. That's their reason for existing, and that's, I don't see that as a flaw. That's the whole purpose of the design of these criteria. The problem with doing that, with how that gets applied in rehabs, is the reality on the ground for the vast majority of projects is that there's a really narrow range of what makes sense to do and what options are available. I mean, to state the obvious, you can't change the location. It is where it is. There's usually not much you can or necessarily would even want to do with regard to its financing. You know, if it's got a tremendously below market loan through HUD insurance, or if it's got ongoing operating assistance, all that's good, and you don't want it to change. And so you wouldn't come up with any reason to propose it to change. And even the rehabilitation work itself, there are some judgment calls to be made on that front, but a lot of things are not decisions to be made. I mean, like if the HVAC system is 20 years old and hadn't been changed out, then it needs a new HVAC system. Whereas if someone replaced the roof a couple of years ago, then you really don't need to replace the roof. It's good. And so, and those are on the extremes, but a lot of things fall in those kinds of categories. But if you create a system where developers have an incentive, where you lay out, here's what we want you to do, here's the incentive, and specify how that's going to work, then they're going to figure out some way to take that reality and put it into that box to sometimes to the extent that maybe isn't entirely logical on the ground. And again, I don't mean that as a critique. If anything, the states that do that, that's more of a critique on the state for creating that incentive system than it is for the developers to respond to it. So what we've got here is a set of criteria which acknowledge that on the ground reality. So what developers do is they bring to the authority the properties that need the work. And the authority looks at each of them based on these criteria and determines which ones are the most worthy of an award, again, based on these criteria. And you have there on the page what I propose as the factors that matter, but those are just ones that I have seen in other states and I personally think make sense. There's certainly any number of others which could be logical to include in there. But the point is that it doesn't actually use a numerical point scoring system. Instead, it's a subjective comparative evaluation using staff expertise. And again, I get that may seem outlandish, but it actually happens in several other states and it can work really well. So with that, before moving on to the new construction criteria, I should probably pause for questions or comments on that new concept.
So Mark, this is Lisa again. I'm glad that you did include here properties identified by local government as in need of rehabilitation for community revitalization purposes. It's great to see it here. I'm just wondering though, it would seem to me there's a case to be made, let me put it that way, actually push that up rather than having it where it is. So I'm just curious as to, I'm sure that you have very solid reasoning behind what you proposed. And I'm just wondering if there's a reason that shouldn't, in your mind, be productively pushed up as a little bit higher priority.
Well, and there's absolutely a case to be made for that. As far as the rank order of these, there certainly is no right answer. It's just, people making their own, ultimate judgment calls. The reason for the first one is because of how that can be an indicator of the tenant's quality of life. And so thinking that if, you know, we all know that some of these properties, you know, if or folks are living in some not great conditions, maybe that doesn't happen very often in Connecticut, that'd be excellent. But in, you know, where I live here in North Carolina, there's some 40-something-year-old HUD properties where folks are living in some really bad circumstances, and market rate housing in some cases. And the need is to go in and improve their life circumstance. So that's the reason for it being number one. The next one being high is because often the real value of these properties is not the structure itself. You know, in some cases, the structure itself might even be borderline functionally obsolete, but it's the setting in which there is project-based rent assistance. The big one, of course, being the HUD programs, but of course, USDA Rural Development has programs as well. And so what those do, as we all know, that allows someone who has zero income to live somewhere affordably. And so that's the real value, is that ongoing subsidy system. And so and so that's the others. And so the next to these are actually kind of toss-ups. The re-syndications, that can be an issue in some states, you know, where you've got the year 15 issue coming up and the owners are concerned about what they're going to do with their, you know, their properties. But there, as someone else noted, there are other resources available. In some cases, those can make a lot of sense to fix up without a lot of subsidy, and instead just go in and give them a loan to, again, change out the HVAC systems, maybe put on a new roof, pave the driveway, and do all that with an appropriated resource as opposed to credits. That sometimes can be the most logical approach. And that next one, the rate ratio of hard cost development budget, that's really, it's another way of saying, arguably another way of saying what that first criteria is. And so that's something that wouldn't even have to necessarily be there. And then yes, the local government, that there's actually a couple of reasons for that to be in there. One is because it makes sense, and number two is because there's actually a Section 42 requirement for QAPs to have something like that. Note that what I'm saying there is sometimes things that are required in Section 42 don't make sense, but this is one that actually does. And so, because there certainly are instances where fixing up a property can bring a whole neighborhood back to life, and that can be really crucial. And so, which I obviously don't need to tell you about. So yes, those are just an overview of those criteria. But again, none of what I just said is by any means right or wrong. It's just one perspective on how to look at things.
This is Kathy. Just a couple comments. I agree with the projects requiring more work, and that probably goes hand in hand too with properties identified by local government.
Probably so, yes.
And I guess the idea of projects that have project-based rent assistance, I'm wondering though, that in LIHTC re-syndications, if projects have project-based rental assistance, you know, they probably can support a little more debt, and would a 4% credit be a better way to deal with that? Same reason with the LIHTC re-syndications, because those often they don't need the same amount of work, like you said. So, I mean, I get the idea that you want to preserve projects that really serve people with very low incomes, but a lot of times those projects just have very low rents, which is also a whole other conversation, I guess. But I know the properties that we have where we have project-based assistance, you know, they cash flow really well and could support other debt and wouldn't need a 9% credit if we were to renovate them.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's actually something, so having just critiqued Michigan, I'll now note something that they do really well, which is they have the ability as an agency to tell developers upon proposing a rehabilitation, actually, you want 9% credits, but we think it works as a bond deal. So that's what you get, take it or leave it. And so that's a path that's been blazed by another agency. So it is certainly something that's within the ability to do. And because you're absolutely right that those can be more likely to be feasible, particularly now with the 4% minimum rate. Now, obviously, there are some really small properties that have rent assistance, which wouldn't be able to justify the transactional costs of a bond deal. But really, and I don't know the specific numbers in your state, but in a lot of states, as long as the property's got 80 units, give or take, and has a good contract, good rent assistance contract, it's at least worth considering as a bond deal, and maybe will work just fine. And again, the 4% minimum rate, I mean, that is such a game changer for a lot of this. A lot of things that weren't possible before as bond deals are going to be now. And so what's actually going to be interesting is that resource becoming tremendously more competitive. And so the notion of so what will happen is in a lot of states is it's going to be less about, well, we want it to be a bond deal because that's the available resource and 9% are more competitive. It's going to be more just that, well, both of these are competitive, but this one is a better fit and makes more sense for this other resource. And so that's going to be the way that's going to change in the future. All right, well, we got 15 minutes left. That's, well, or I guess, yeah, 16. Maybe we should move on to the new construction criteria. And the main thing I want to talk about here is less the individual criteria, although as you'll see, there's a lot of discussion of those, and more of a way that they can work. And then I would imagine this group maybe should spend some time talking about the opportunity maps, but I'll defer to my CHFA clients on how that particular topic. But what I wanted to talk about here with regard to comparing opportunities, and I've also got here a way to look at proximity to amenities, is a different way to assess, a different way to score competing proposals. The way most QAP work, developers are able to look at a particular set of facts on the ground and know that they get X number of points for that particular set of facts on the ground. Whether it's, to continue with these examples, they're in a particular census tract or town, and that allows them to know they're going to get the maximum opportunity points, for example. Or as happens in my home state, if you're within a mile and a half of a grocery store and a Target, you know that you get the maximum distance to amenity points. And so when you have systems that operate like that, as the one that's creating the incentives, you have to make a choice along a continuum. Either you make it so that those criteria are very important in differentiating the outcomes. So, to pick an extreme example, say you were to say only one spot in your state got the maximum opportunity points and then everything else got less. Or if you said, that being directly adjacent, you're sharing a wall with a Trader Joe's and there's a Walmart on the other side of your property, that's the only way you get the maximum points for distance to amenities. You could, if you did it that way, then with each increment less than that, you got less points. Then those criteria would really matter. They'd be very consequential in determining the outcomes. But they drive developers to make choices, which you then have to reflect in other criteria, namely, they pay too much for the land. And again, that's not a critique, that's just them acting rationally in response to the criteria that are set up. So in the other extreme of the continuum, you can make it so that those criteria are easy to meet. So let's say half of your state got the maximum opportunity points, or as long as you're within 10 miles of a grocery store, you got the maximum distance to amenity points. Then anyone would get it. And so you don't have developers acting in what would otherwise be irrational manners, like bidding way too much for land. And yet those criteria then wouldn't have any effect. And so what most states do is they try to pick somewhere in between along that continuum, along that line. And that's okay, but you just have to recognize that, again, you're choosing where you're going to be in that range of choices. What I'm proposing here is a third alternative where developers don't know for certain what their point score is going to be. And so they find whatever's the best site they can find in terms of, again, as I've proposed, your opportunity or distance to amenities, but it could be all kinds of things. And then they bring it to the authority. They say, okay, this is where I'm located. I'm, this census tract, this town, so for this opportunity consideration, and or I'm this distance from grocery stores. And then the authority takes all that data and ranks everyone against each other, and whoever did the best gets the most points. Whoever does the second best gets the next amount of points, and so on and so forth. And it reflects the fact that in making those choices as a developer, some of them can do a better job than others. And that, though, may not be popular because they won't know going in what their score is going to be. But again, it reflects the fact that this is a competition. So that's what I've proposed here for how those two different criteria can work. Again, recognizing that it's a pretty radical concept, but again, it's one that I think makes sense. And I know as a state, you're very much not afraid to innovate, which is one of the reasons I'm happy to work with you. So I probably should pause for questions and or to see if the group wants to discuss the opportunity possibilities, of which I don't have enough knowledge to comment myself. So maybe Terry, if you wanted to, or someone wanted to jump in, Nandini, with some directions to, unless there's some questions on the rambling that I just did a second ago, because that was a whole lot of words.
That was helpful information, Mark, and I think it ties into a little bit with the opportunity maps, and could, like, in theory, be in the same category, the same broad category, but it's a little different in that the opportunity map was derived from, sort of an intensive look at what constitutes the best quality of life for residents. And so we've had, I think everyone might have been on the board task force meeting after the last boards. This was maybe a couple of weeks ago, where we had a presentation of the opportunity map. And it really talks about, where are job opportunities, where is the poverty level lower than the statewide, education is higher or more available. That's a little different than being close to amenities, which is another quality of life factor. So that's why I say they could complement one another, but they're not the same exact thing. So in terms of the measuring for amenities, that sounds like it's pretty specific. You're geographically close or you're not. Opportunity maps, it sounds like the suggestion here is that people locate where they're going to locate, and then it comes in and the one that meets the best criteria is the top scorer, the one that has the least is the bottom, and then there's some degree in between, correct? If I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
What does everybody think about the amenities approach along with, in conjunction with, or not at all, as a, including with opportunity maps?
Terry, can you remind me again, in the opportunity maps, is access to public transportation, and that's accounted for, isn't it, in the opportunity maps?
So just John Cabral here to step in. The opportunity map the QAP has given points for TOD, for transit-oriented development, so that would be proximity to transit, but it's not part of the actual new opportunity map that we worked with GOH on. That opportunity map really has to do with education, the economy, and it's really about desegregation of poverty. So when it looks at amenities, as in, let's say, the grocery store, a perfect example, it doesn't really speak to that. Doesn't mean that that can't be added as a separate points item, but it's not part of the DOH CHFA new state map as a different policy objective.
So is this suggesting then that you wouldn't get points for having a property in a town with a good education system and get additional points if it was near a train station, say, if you can't compete in the CRP, which seems like an unfortunate acronym. But anyway, so if you,
I think
you
it's
wouldn't compete in
suggesting,
both, right?
I mean, I think it's suggesting more of a an analysis of the applications that come in and some valuation of the opportunity score, the amenities that are available around that opportunity, around that area, as well as maybe transit-oriented development and whether that, so in other words, you sort of create a aggregate valuation of all of these three things: transit, amenities, opportunity, and then based on that, you make a determination of the applications that come in and you score according to what is in front of you in terms of how they've maximized all three of those areas. I don't know if I said that well, but.
Yeah, that makes just one quick point. So going back to the old CHFA opportunity map, which was based on the town level, not census tract. In that QAP, and Terry can correct me if I'm wrong, we had points associated with transit-oriented development, which is much more neighborhood-oriented. And in fact, it could be much smaller than the census tract. So I think when it comes to points on a map, like certain amenities, it makes sense to have that separate than how opportunity map is calculated at the census tract level. So I don't think you have to pick and choose one against the other. It just might be a different way of tackling that. So you can get points for transit, for being next to a grocery store, and you can also have a map that helps reach the policy objective of desegregation or reducing concentrations of poverty.
Hey, Terry, it's Tim Hodges. I have no problem with the way that it's been described. The only thing that I would add is I don't think it should be and I hate to use the word secret, but I think we should let people know that this is, an opportunity, right? The idea that we would score folks and then tell them later on that they scored higher because they were next to a grocery store or something like that, I think is not going to go over very well in this state.
I think that's a good point, Tim. And if we want to be really agile and transparent, it would be something we'd need to share with our development community very early on if we were contemplating going down that path, so that people would be aware. But there are certainly other ways of approaching it, assigning points as we've always done, or maybe making some kind of gross point award, not just as narrow as we have had, because we could tend to drive people to a particular community if that's what we want to do with the points, it all depends.
And that's actually one of the beauties of the preliminary full application process, is it lets developers know how they compare to everybody else, because that's ultimately what matters. It's less about how many points your project is going to get and more about how many points your project is going to get compared to everybody else. And before you invest a lot of money.
Can I just ask if we could for a moment, and apologies if I didn't follow this properly, but I just want to turn back to the question of housing and opportunity areas and proximity to transit, because I think it's really important to remember the reality of life for the type of family that may want to live in affordable housing in a high cost area, which the opportunity areas, a lot of them are going to be high cost. These are not likely to be families for whom it is easy to maintain their own car. That's a whole other level of expense that may be very hard for them. So I'm not perhaps following clearly, but I think it's really important that we don't think of housing anywhere in that opportunity area as equal, right? Because it's not. Housing near public transit is much better for the type of family that needs the subsidy than housing, the same housing located in a place that you must own a car to get to, right? So I guess I might not be following clearly, but I just think it would be, personally, I think it'd be a mistake if we don't actually very intentionally find a way to prioritize providing those housing opportunities in the opportunity areas in a way that at least seeks to answer that question of access to public transportation.
Yeah, that would argue, implementing it that way would argue for having two distinct criteria. There'd be the opportunity assessment, and then separate from that would be the ability to walk to a bus stop or some other type of transit there. So you get points either way. This does propose in this write-up, though, a way to having the opportunity score be distinct from the revitalization plan score. That is one thing maybe worth mentioning, and that doesn't have to be the approach by any means, but the idea being that those two are often not going to be in the same circumstance. And so and I will say, I mean, as everyone probably knows, Section 42 does mandate that the QAPs have a preference for projects which contribute to a concerted community revitalization plan. So there's got to be something in there. The question is, how does that work out? And it's an inherently difficult thing because there's no one way to describe a revitalization plan. Some agencies punt on this, and they basically say if a local government says it's a revitalization plan, then boom, we'll accept that. And that works, but it's kind of an abdication of the agency's task of assessing it on their own. Some agencies, though, they just aren't empowered to do that. But you guys are. You have the support and the authority to make those kinds of decisions. And so this has proposed criteria. And I would say that the key here is that the more demanding the criteria, the more consequential the outcome should be. And so, and this proposes basically a 2-level set, because the Section 42 also mentions being within a qualified census tract, but there's any number of ways you can award points for revitalization.
This is Kylie. I just want to note too, in addition to the federal requirement here for the revitalization plan, Connecticut also requires every town, by law to create an affordable housing plan. And that may be something that we want to consider factoring in here, especially as it relates to the high opportunity areas, which, as we all know, developers have traditionally shied away from because of the NIMBYism zoning challenges that tend to go on a long time and cost a lot of money legally. The nice thing about the AHP requirement is that it should identify particular locations where a town would be willing to entertain a project, which means we're much more likely to see those credits used in a timely fashion versus having to kick them out a year or not ever see a project placed in service. So it's not the same as the revitalization thing, but in Connecticut, especially the Department of Housing, just along with our friends at the Regional Plan Association, put together some guidance on this for towns. So I'm just putting a pin in that for our future discussions, because I think it may be something that could also help us streamline some of that high opportunity development components and work with towns where they've already identified locations or opportunities and willingness.
Thank you, Kylie. And that was a good segue, as you say, put a pin in it, because this would be a perfect conversation to continue later when we talk about best practices and what other states have done. And we've done a lot of research on community revitalization plans. So having another resource would be terrific. As we're near the end of our time together, if anyone has any final thoughts, please share. Otherwise, we will look forward to meeting with you all again right after the board meeting in just a couple weeks, actually. But are there any final thoughts, comments?
I have a question. Sorry, and I know
Yes,
Tim
go ahead.
wanted to say something, but if the board task force could give us some direction about whether you think this is worth pursuing. And by that, I mean the idea of creating different set-asides from the ones we currently have. We've got general and public, so pursue something more intentional along the lines of the preservation construction that Mark outlined. And maybe a way to flesh out a little bit under each of those what they might look like, and then present that to you for further consideration.
It's Tim. I do believe we should consider this, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about this a little more after our next meeting. I think, but I'm going to go back to what I said at the beginning of last year, right? Which is, I really do believe we need to get to a point where we've got some certainty around something that's going to be, that we're going to implement and do for a number of years, as opposed to kind of making changes each year. And so this is what I want to make sure happens, is that, you know, once we have this discussion and make these changes, that we can say to people, look, this is what you're going to be living with for the next whatever period of time. And I would like to talk to you, maybe you, Nandini, and Terry, about the public housing side as well. I do have a couple thoughts, but we obviously don't need to do that right now.
Terry, do you need just a straw poll? Because I know I've got to drop immediately. I'm sure others do too.
Yeah.
But do you want a straw poll, or what do you need?
Yeah, I think if we just have some agreement that we can move forward to present to you at the next meeting, a more fleshed out version of the two different classifications with the set-asides that are mandatory or potential for consideration, like the unique opportunities, for example. And then to carve out some of these things based on the points that you made earlier, to carve out some and refine some of these points, so that then at the next meeting, we can kind of formalize where we're going to take our next steps. Does that make sense?
Terry, do you need a vote?
If you're comfortable with that, that would
I don't
be
know.
wonderful.
That's what we need. Okay.
Yeah.
Are you all in favor of continuing on this path?
Hi.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, so unanimous, motion carries.
Perfect.
Great.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. I appreciate
Thank you.
that. Thanks,
Thanks.
everyone.
Bye.
All right. Have a
Thank you,
great,
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you,
great rest of
Mark.
the day.